I also think that misinformation research is a very specific topic, of course, where the journalism perspective is one that's kind of part of the ecosystem. And so maybe this is a little bit different. I spent a year as a Night Science Journalism Fellow at MIT, and when I was there, I really liked going to this talk. So I remember Lisa Fazio talking about, illusory truth effect, or very memorably, Gordon Pennycook and Sander van der Linden duking it out on inoculation. And that's been really helpful. And so I'm really glad that I get to speak to you here as well. Obviously, this will be a little bit different since I'm a journalist and not a researcher. So I wanted to start with a little bit of kind of my personal history and context here to kind of explain how I even got into this and why. And I've been covering infectious diseases at Science. That's really how I got into science journalism, was infectious diseases. I've been doing that at Science for 15 years. That's really long, actually. And kind of kept me busy. In fact, it's kept me so busy, like I've been saying for 15 years, I want to write about fungi at some point, and every time I try to do it, some virus comes along and gets all the attention, and so I never actually get to do that. But there's obviously always been, in a lot of these outbreaks that I've covered, there's always been misinformation, right? That's always been part of what we're talking about. And there's one example that I remember very vividly that was really important for me, really changed my view on a lot of things in life and in journalism, was the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014-15. And I went to Liberia at the time and reported from there. So this is a photo I took in Bong County. So it was kind of an interesting experience because you arrived in Monrovia, and Monrovia was overrun with all the NGOs, the German Red Cross, UNIMIL, the UN peacekeepers, everybody was there, right? And we ended up going north to an Ebola treatment unit in Bong County, a more rural place, to kind of figure out what was actually happening. And you saw these posters everywhere, Ebola is real. And I remember very vividly when I came back, a lot of people, both in the US and in Germany actually, like asking me, like, what is wrong with these people in West Africa? How can they not believe that this virus is real? Like, people are dying, that's crazy. And of course, I don't see anybody asking that in the next pandemic we go through, because we've all just had the experience worldwide, really, of that kind of sentiment playing a role. And there were, to be fair, in Liberia, a lot of really good reasons why you had a population that was incredibly distrustful of the government, that had never seen this particular virus or disease before. So it was a very specific situation. And there was a part of me that at the time I think felt like, okay, this makes a lot of sense here. I'm not sure, I can't go back and ask myself, I'm not sure what I would have said, but I don't think I expected a pandemic to be as kind of crazy in terms of the misinformation as it actually turned out to be. So COVID-19 for me, I was busy covering COVID-19. I was also spending way too much time on Twitter, but I thought, this is my moment to kind of like be on Twitter. And, I actually, for once, I'm the expert who actually has some knowledge and can kind of try to explain things to people. And I was just shocked by the amount of misinformation that was going around and the type of misinformation. And I kind of saw it more out of the corner of my eye because I was concentrating on doing other things and just concentrating on trying to explain what we actually knew. But after the pandemic, I really tried to figure out for myself, okay, how much of what we saw there was different in scale because the pandemic was different in scale? I mean, there's a good reason to think this was unprecedented, so maybe it's not surprising if the misinformation stuff is unprecedented. And then came Mpox, which I was very busy, and I'm a gay man. This was like part of, like, my community was the one that was most impacted by this worldwide. And I was shocked by the amount of misinformation that was out there, even though this was an outbreak that was really affecting a fairly small and defined group of people worldwide. No comparison to COVID-19. And yet the misinformation just seemed to be going at the same rate. And I think that for me was really the moment when I said, okay, I feel I have to understand this. If I'm going to keep being an infectious disease reporter, I have to understand what is actually going on. And so I applied for the Night Science Journalism program as a fellow with this idea of very much relate to what Adam says at the beginning of one of the stories I wrote, where he's like, he thought he'd come into the space, figure out what was wrong, why people believed nonsense, how to change it, and then get out again. And I was like, you've been doing this for 10 years. I was like, 10 months sounds fine. Like, I just want to know what to do about this. And of course, that's not how it turned out. So I thought the story that I wrote that I just mentioned was this one. So I wrote a package of 3 stories, and one of them was this overview, trying to look at the field's dilemmas. So today I thought I'd try to kind of turn that around and look at the dilemmas of that I face as a journalist covering this, some of which overlaps, of course, and others which doesn't. But maybe to set this up a little bit better, one of the things I told my editors when I went to Boston was, look, I think this is really important, and like I get a head start of 10 months to like really delve into all of this. And then I would love to kind of make this my beat, to keep reporting on misinformation as kind of a beat and see, kind of cover it as it goes on. And it's kind of funny because I am always a little bit conflicted as a journalist about expertise. It's a very kind of complicated thing you have to figure out. So my dad was a diplomat. When I grew up, I spent 7 years in London as a kid because he was twice sent to London. And then after a few years, your country wants you back home because they want to avoid you going native, basically, right? So on the one hand, you're building up this expertise, but on the other hand, they want to make sure you're kind of working in the interests of the country that's sending you. And then, so that's one end of the spectrum where you're basically saying, okay, 3-4 years, go back. And then at the other end, you have what most of you are doing, which is probably a lifetime of studying like in a certain field. And as a science journalist, you're like somewhere on that spectrum between building up a lot of expertise over many years, but also the danger of not really being an advocate for the reader anymore and seeing what the questions are and being too close to people in the field and all of these things. And so that for me was, after a lot of years of doing infectious disease research, there was also part of me that was like, maybe it's good to go into a new field. And at the beginning, I remember this very vividly. Like at the beginning when I came, I thought, this is amazing. Like there's all of this research and nobody's really covering it. And in retrospect, I feel a little bit like those, gullible colonists you see in like science fiction movies who are like, the generational starship like descends and you're like, oh, this is amazing. This planet has everything. It even has houses already built that have been abandoned for some reason, but it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, you all know how this ends. There's always monsters in the end. And so I thought what I do today is to look at the monsters that I've encountered in this field. And I think I should, so in a good science fiction movie, this will obviously be the ending, right? The monster is always inside you. Think like Ripley, Alien 3. Sorry for the spoiler. The movie is a few years old. I think it's fine. But all I'm trying to say here is when you're covering the information ecosystem, the first dilemma you're stuck in as a journalist is that you're part of the information ecosystem, and a fairly kind of crucial part. I mean, everybody's kind of part of this information ecosystem, but you're actually somebody who provides a certain service in that information ecosystem. And that creates a few interesting issues that keep coming up for me as a science journalist. The first one is that we all make mistakes. And when you make a mistake as a science journalist covering misinformation, then basically, of course, you can be accused of spreading misinformation. And it's just an awkward thing to go through. And it's not really hypothetical because the very first story I wrote was called On the Trail of Bullshit. So this I wrote before I came here. This was when I was trying to maybe get into misinformation research. And what I did, also very typical journalist, I was like, well, I'm covering COVID-19 and there's Carl Bergstrom who's doing work on COVID-19. He's also interested in misinformation and doing that a little bit. And doing a profile of somebody means that you don't have to understand the entire field. You can basically, like focus on one person and their opinion. So it was a good way for me to get into this. But within the story, I quote a paper that some people at MIT at the time had written, Deb Roy, Sinan Aral, I think, like basically, yes, exactly. So fake news spreads faster than, lies spread faster than truth. And I made a pretty big mistake, which was I talked to a lot of scientists about that paper and about a paper that came out later that kind of re-examined that. And instead of talking to the person who had written that paper re-examining it, I didn't get to do that. And so I wrote it up saying, so this is what they had found, but then a later reanalysis actually suggested that if you account for the fact that they're just looking at fake news that have been vetted, so that have reached a certain amount of people so that they're interesting enough to fact checkers to even look at them, if you account for that, then basically the difference collapses, which is not what the re-examination showed. The re-examination showed that it's spreading faster, wider, and other things came down to just one quality of this. It wasn't like a whole pattern of different things that you could use as a fingerprint. Anyway, so that left me, I figured that out after I had written this article, and I got an email from the person who had written that actual paper. So I was left in the very unenviable position of having to write a Twitter thread explaining. And as I wrote here, oh boy, this is a correction I really wish I didn't have to write. In my first big piece on misinformation in science, I ended up misinforming readers about a study on misinformation in science. So that's like, it gets meta very fast, right? That's the problem when you write about misinformation and you're human and you make mistakes. And so I wrote this thread, and after I'd gone through the thread, I think one of the replies by somebody was, oh boy, I sure hope this is right. I was like, yeah, yes, so do I. But because I'm a journalist and I'm part of this information ecosystem, by the time I wrote this, another journalist who worked at The Atlantic had already written a thread. He had latched onto exactly that part of my story that was wrong. And he had written, I love this so much. Remember the science paper showing that misinformation travels farther and faster? It was wrong. But the reanalysis didn't get nearly as much media coverage. And then he had a photo, it's not on anymore, but he had a photo of that sentence in my story. Then, of course, that person also saw that I had made a mistake and had a mistake. So then he wrote a piece in The Atlantic called, sorry, I lied about fake news, a false tweet really does move, and explained the whole, how I had done a mistake on a paper and had then tweeted it, and then he had read it and made a mistake in retweeting it. And you could argue that, sorry, I lied about fake news is again fake news because he didn't lie, right? I mean, he clearly, it wasn't intentional what he did. He clearly was spreading misinformation. Anyway, as you can see, it gets very complicated. And it's, as a journalist, it's just, I mean, it feels uncomfortable, right? And to get that much attention for like having made a mistake is really not very comfortable. It wasn't, in the grand scheme of things, not an important mistake. It's one I shouldn't have made. But this is just part of like the kind of dilemma you face when you're in the space, I think. It's far from the only one. I think the maybe more important ones are that you, because you're part of the information ecosystem, the decisions you make about how you navigate in that information ecosystem are visible to other people, and you are basically revealing your preferences on certain things. Do you stay on X or not? I think that's a really crucial question. I made a decision at some point that I think it's a semi-fascist hellhole that I don't want to be a part of. But like, that's right. Like, you can't take yourself completely out of it and be like, I'm a neutral observer. Now, luckily, I've always been a believer in like the Jay Rosen kind of, there's no view from nowhere view of journalism. So I actually think that the way out of this particular dilemma is fairly easy. You make a mistake and you make sure that the correction is, front and center everywhere. And that way you're actually hopefully even modeling how to do it. And like, and surprisingly, I have to say the responses, at least on Twitter at the time, were very positive for the, like, I would have thought I would get killed, and most people were like, whatever, kudos for correcting this. So I think sometimes, I mean, you'd still have to do it even if it was that, but I think the kind of the fears maybe are also bigger than what really happens. But either way, you have to kind of deal with this. And the other thing is, now that I'm a journalist writing about misinformation, I often get asked by colleagues about how to deal with misinformation, right? So then you're suddenly in the position of not just kind of communicating the science or trying to understand it, but like trying to give real world advice, right? Nobody asks a journalist covering cancer research to give them advice on cancer treatment, but when you're covering misinformation, people kind of, you're a journalist, you're covering misinformation, what do we need to know about this? So actually, and the Night Science Journalism program asked me last year to write a piece called, like, basically advice for journalists who have to approach misinformation, come across misinformation in their work. And I was very happy to do this, but also, of course, I do understand this very much as a kind of living document. And so the reason I'm putting this up here is that I hope if any of you look at this and feel like there's stuff, that could be added or that's wrong, do let me know. I'm essentially just like writing down the things that I've learned from covering this over the years. And luckily, like one of the first things, because I met Brian early on in my time here, like for instance, the backfire effect is something that you see journalists fretting about all the time still. It's like a huge issue when we're talking about correcting misinformation. And even though we're pretty sure now that it doesn't matter, or at least it shouldn't keep you from doing a proper correction, it's interesting that that's a very interesting example where we can all see how sticky this kind of information is once it's out there. And I think there's something about it, by the way, I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something psychological there where you're like, it's this counterintuitive thing that we always go for. It's like, oh, you think that you should be correct in this, but actually, if you do that, you might be making it worse. Like it makes you sound a lot smarter than you are if you say that. But yeah, I think that makes it very sticky for some reason. It's kind of hard to get out of. So that's the first dilemma. I mean, it's definitely not the most important one, but I wanted to cover that. And then the biggest monster / dilemma that I probably face is the complexity that you're all dealing with in misinformation research. And I think I really struggled with this when I was doing my fellowship, because just the idea of getting your arms around this problem, like trying to even figure out where does this end? Like where's the part of the world that I can ignore and it feels like there's nothing. I described to even describe it, I was telling Brian, yesterday I was on a plane and trying to figure out this part of the talk. And I could feel the frustration rising in me, the same frustration that I had when I was here for 10 months, because it's just so amorphous in a way, and it's so everywhere. So on the one hand, the way that I think about it now, on the one hand, if you pull on any one thread, you end up with everything in the world being connected to it, essentially, right? At the moment, I'm looking at AI and misinformation. I'm trying to answer a seemingly fairly simple question, which is, how is AI going to change the problem of misinformation? There's a banal answer, that is, it makes it way easier to produce stuff. It's generative AI, so clearly there'll be much more of it. That is definitely correct, but it's also boring and banal. And as soon as you drill down deeper, you realize that there's 50 dimensions of uncertainty that are wrapped up in this. I don't know if you all saw, but there was a blog post the other day by Dan Williams, basically arguing that AI is going to lead to a kind of epistemic convergence. So the idea that we have, a couple of big AI companies, and we actually, if you go to any chatbot, his basic argument is if you go to any chatbot and ask them about vaccines, what you get is on average going to be a little bit better than what you get on average if you go to social media. And so overall, if kind of that's how it ends up, then overall that should actually lead to a kind of, to a lessening of the belief in misinformation. That's, of course, predicated on a lot of kind of assumptions. And then someone else, I've forgotten who now, wrote a very good blog post kind of pointing out what he thought the problems were with some of these arguments. And you basically get into the question of, first of all, okay, what's the AI landscape going to look like? Is there going to be 3 companies with big chatbots? Are we all going to be interacting with chatbots all the time? If we do, what happens to the underlying information in the internet? Because there's no incentive anymore to put anything into the internet if nobody visits your website, because everybody gets the information you just put out there from the chatbot. So there's a question about what does that even look like? Or what if everybody has their own personal chatbot? There's this idea that you could have a chatbot that basically has a kind of almost fiduciary responsibility to you, the idea that they are trained to only respond to what you actually need. Or are we going to get just thousands of chatbots on every website that you're interacting with all the time? Who's controlling them, right? What avenues are there? How are they being monetized? Is there going to be advertising? So you get into all of these questions that are basically unanswerable about what the future actually looks like. And that's just kind of like this very small portion of the AI interactions, right? That's without even looking into, the hallucinations, the question of how that evolves, the question of what are people actually going to ask these chatbots? Like, does it matter? Does the way that I phrase a question as a vaccine skeptic versus the way that I phrase a question as a, kind of somebody who believes that vaccines are good, does that change what the chatbot spits out, particularly if it's so kind of sycophantic and trying to please me? Like, what happens if people spend, millions of hours with these chatbots over time? Like, so there's this kind of there's this banal answer that's easy, and then there's maybe the real answer that's infinitely complex, I would say. And in between, there's very little. And like, the reason I chose this, I don't know if anybody has seen Everything Everywhere All at Once, but it reminds me a lot of the Everything Bagel, because it's literally like there's a hole in the middle, which is also kind of the vagueness of the underlying concept of misinformation. Like, we keep coming back to what even is misinformation. So there's kind of like this hole in the middle, and then as soon as you get out of that, you attract everything in the world into the vicinity of what you're trying to answer. And you basically end up with a black hole that swallows everything, including, your will to live. So that I would say is kind of the biggest problem, because for me as a journalist, there is something interesting about pondering these questions. But if I, as a journalist, write an article that's like, you have a question? Well, here are 50 other questions that we can't answer yet that are linked to the question you have. Not something my editors generally will go for, or any reader, right? And so, I thought I was coming to Boston to get into like the nitty-gritty of things. There's this field of misinformation research. It's a complex machinery, but it's defined. The parts of the machinery, the cogs, they're all there. I just don't understand them. And so once I've understood the complexity, I can break it down. But that's not the complexity we're talking about. We're talking about an amorphous mass of kind of lots of ill-defined pieces with lots of uncertainty interacting in ways that we barely understand and changing at basically every second, right? That complexity is the worst kind of complexity, because you can't explain it. It's kind of boring in a way. It doesn't, like, if I write about whatever, quantum cryptography or evolutionary virology, that's complex, but people kind of expect it to be complex. And you have a lot of leeway in breaking it down, and you are helping explain it. So during the pandemic, one of the things that always came up was this idea that people think, hey, over time, a virus becomes more benign because it has to like keep its host alive or whatever, right? That's clearly nonsense if you think evolutionarily, right? It depends a lot on how exactly a virus is transmitted. If the virus is transmitted by other animals going to the carcass of an animal, then clearly the virus needs you to die to be transmitted, right? For instance, like, there's all of these, and you can explain these different factors, and you actually get, in my experience during the pandemic, this was really helpful. You give people something that is understandable, that they can hold on to, and that they feel like, okay, I've understood a little bit more. It is more complex, but it's more complex in a way that kind of makes sense. And my problem with the misinformation complexity is I never get out of this problem that either it's banal and everybody's like, yes, I know, different people, you read different media, whatever, or you're basically not explaining anything. You're just making it worse. How do you deal with that as a journalist? I think the worst way that I've also seen a lot is to chart a course that fits one narrative. Because part of the kind of consequences of all of this is that you have so many data pieces that you can choose from, that if you choose a certain framing, you can very easily say, I know who to call. Like, I mean, I can call Sasha Altai and, Dan Williams and what's his name, Mercier, and I can maybe throw in a little, fake news 2016. It was all, I can get some quotes from David that maybe we kind of overestimated, used the research by Jennifer Allen on the actual prevalence of it. There you go. It's a story about how it was all a big bunch of baloney, and we can all move on. Or, of course, I know I can, call other people. I can call Steven Lewandowski. I can call Sander van der Linden, and they're going to tell me, yeah, this is a huge problem, and democracy is threatened, and we need to do something, or we're all going to die, essentially, right? I'm not being like, all of these people are very thoughtful people who have who have, I think, good arguments, but clearly the truth is not simply in the middle of them, right? Like, there is a right and a wrong, and it is my job as a journalist to figure that out. Now, this is, of course, where it gets complicated, because of what I'm telling you now is that once I figured it out, I'm going to do exactly what I just said I shouldn't, which is take the pieces of the narrative that fit and explain that to people, because I personally believe that those are the data pieces that matter. So it's very hard to not kind of lose your belief in our way of looking at the world when doing this, because I can't just like throw all this data at people and be like, you sort it out. But also, if I sort it out, I fall into a lot of the traps that the misinformation research tells me are everywhere, right? So it's a very uncomfortable position kind of to be in, which is why you end up writing about the problems of the field. Like, here are some problems the field has. Let me just not have to make a call on what's actually going on, right? So that's kind of, that's one thing that you can do. I think the other thing that I'm coming around to that I really wasn't expecting when I came. So because my background, I studied molecular biomedicine, my background is, I really want people to just like do an experiment and like replicate it, and it's all the same every time, right? And I'm like, why is there a backfire effect now and not now? And here it is again. And like, what are you doing? I was surprised that when I was doing all of this research, the stuff that really felt like it was explaining things to me, like it was making me understand more about the issue, was when I went to see Kate Starbird in Seattle, and I was there for a couple of days. This was actually the day of the debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So they're eating the pets, they're eating the dogs. And they were in the business of basically watching rumors emerge online, understanding where they bubble up from, who then takes them and supercharges them, and how. And yes, it's essentially anecdotes, if you want, but they are like, they're built on a very fine-grained understanding of watching these dynamics play out again and again. And I was surprised when I called some people when I was, so one of the pieces in that package of stories was a profile of Kate Starbird. And I was surprised when I was calling some people, and they were kind of dismissive of the kind of mixed methods approach that she basically uses. That I was the one, even though I come from molecular biomedicine, and I'm like, give me numbers. I was like, that is the most, like, I get way more out of that in a way in terms of just understanding things. And to be fair, also in terms of being able to tell a story, right? Being able to tell a coherent story as a journalist. Here's an example, here's what happened, here's where it, in that story, I trace one of the rumors. I mean, I don't trace it, she's done the work of tracing it, but I just go through and explain how that rumor kind of, evolved and what we can learn from that. And that was incredibly helpful for me to understand it. And I have come around to the idea that these kind of anecdotes, I was talking to Amy Orban a couple of days ago, who does a lot of research on the kind of social media harms children. And she told me, I'm paraphrasing here, but she basically told me, look, I used to really have trouble with the fact that I didn't see any signal in my data across, like, averaged across, thousands and thousands of people. And then I would meet these parents of children who had clearly been harmed by social media. And she said that over time, she had learned to put a lot more kind of stock in these kinds of stories and anecdotes. And I think there's an element here of, the perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. I do think these stories are real, and they're there, and we're clearly, you guys are clearly not managing to answer the question well enough at scale that we can say, oh, let's ignore these stories. We're gonna wait for the good data. And so I do think that we need to, as science journalists, we need to cover these, we need to cover them critically, but we do need to tell these stories because they're very exemplary, I think, of stuff that happens, right? And I think they do give people an idea of what's happening. And we shouldn't forget that there's a huge machinery of very, very wealthy companies that have a huge vested interest in doing exactly what you guys are doing, which is not coming up with an answer, right? I mean, when I was here, I took the class with Naomi Oreskes, Burning Books, Fighting Facts. I mean, that's just like a history lesson of everywhere where, you know, people with a lot of money have managed to cast enough doubt on, you know, scientific facts or to keep a consensus from forming. And that's like, I'm not saying that that's what's happening here. I think the truth is that the problems are so big, it is so hard to answer these questions that they don't have to do much in order. But I do think that they are sitting on a ton of data that could, in theory, answer some of these questions very well. In fact, they might actually have the answers to some of these questions. And so the fact that we're not doing more to get at those, I do think is a real problem. And I think telling the stories of proven harm where they are or showing them are important for that. Sorry, I'm never sure how long my talks are going to take, and I'm realizing I'm taking way longer than I wanted to. This is the other monster. This is probably the one that annoys me the most. I really like this illustration. It took me a while to come up with a monster for caveats I like, but I was like, I always feel like caveats are basically like these little monsters that nibble away at your conclusions from all these sides. And the bad news is in misinformation, you have so many caveats in each of your papers that there's often not a lot left for me to work with, right? That's really, like, that's not your fault, but I was reading this, let me look it up. I was reading a review. It was actually, it's not out yet, but there was a half sentence in it that just says, scholars have found that algorithms do not appear to cause mass polarization, e.g. Guess et al. 2023. For those who don't follow every single paper, Guess et al. Is a very famous paper that we published at Science, in which essentially they worked together during the run-up to the 2020 elections. They worked together with Meta to change the algorithm for some people that basically changed their algorithm into a chronologic algorithm, a reverse chronologic. So you see whatever was the latest post is what you see at the top of your timeline. And they didn't find a difference in terms of effective polarization and a few other things, I think. Nothing wrong with that paper, but if I write about that at Science, it's like, okay, so we can say this for 2020 in an election period. We're talking about Facebook, none of the other ones. We're talking about US citizens, no idea what happens in another language in another country. And that's before we get to the fact that this was done with Meta. So you do kind of have to wonder, okay, like how much influence do they have, all of that stuff. And then, of course, we found out later that there was a change in, so they had these break glass interventions that they instituted during the time. So it is absolutely reasonable to think that the comparison between the normal control and the chronological algorithm, that the normal wasn't normal. It was changed to, you know, like the break glass interventions of trying to, even if you ignore all of that altogether, you're still dealing with the problem that, okay, these people don't get an algorithmic feed anymore, but everybody around them does, and everybody who sends them a WhatsApp and everybody who talks to them. And even if that's not a problem for you, you have to be honest and say, okay, but the fact that they're not depolarizing when I change it to chronologic doesn't mean that they didn't polarize in the first place because they had an algorithmic feed. And so I am kind of left as a journalist being like, what do I do here? First of all, the other problem that comes in here is that the public is kind of ahead of you in terms of what they believe. So if the story was, well, they are polarized, then my conversation with my editor would probably be, hey, there's a cool paper that shows that, you know, people actually get polarized by social media. They're like, yeah, didn't we know that? No, actually we didn't. Oh, okay, but now we know it for sure. Well, no, I mean, only in 2020 on Facebook under these conditions. And in this case, it's even, in some ways, I would say, a pretty extraordinary claim. Like it goes against what people expect. So I would want to have pretty good evidence for it, and I don't. And so it's really hard, right? It's really hard to like cover these individual papers. And I have like one of the quotes I had in my story was this one. it's basically, but for now, the field is in a weird place. Many researchers admit trying to prove something that seems obviously true. And then Philipp Lorenz-Spreen told me the situation is almost embarrassing. Everyone has some story, an uncle that got radicalized on WhatsApp or whatever, but proving anything definitively is a difficult job, right? That to me is the kind of the key problem here, is that our lived experience out in the world suggests to most people that something is going on, and the fact that the research doesn't show that is interesting, but given so many caveats, also isn't, you know, ice that I would want to tread on. So what do I do, right? So that's kind of like, just to, I want to wrap it up because I really want to get to questions. This of course is, you know, this is the big one. It's like, what do you do with all of that? Like, other than, you know, go back to viruses and be like, this is amazing. The truth is, I just spent a few days in Berkeley with Hani Farid, you know, going through all the deepfake stuff that he's looking at. Like, Sunday morning, he got the video of the Tomahawk hitting the Iranian school, and he spent his Sunday trying to, you know, see whether this is fake or not. And like, whenever, it's a little bit like the Kate Starboard moment for me. Whenever you go to the people who are dealing on the ground with these things, like, it becomes apparent to you how we have entered this very different world very clearly. But we don't have the tools, apparently, to really kind of prove at scale what is actually happening and how it's impacting us. And so how do I deal with, like, not just, you know, going into full despair? So I was reading, it's really fascinating to go back and read some old stuff. This is Neil Postman, the introduction to his foreword. And in his foreword to Amusing Us to Death, he compares 1984 to Brave New World. And he makes this really interesting point where he says, and I mean, this is, you know, decades ago, he says, Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. And Postman's argument here is we live in the Brave New World rather than in 1984. I find that incredibly prescient. I would amend that clearly now, being in 2026 in Trump's America, we can say that we live in both. Congratulations. You've got the best of both worlds. And that's really scary. But then there's one other dystopia that I read as a kid that I really liked, and that is Clockwork Orange. And Clockwork Orange is really interesting because I remember reading the book, and it has 21 chapters, and it's like 20 chapters of like full-on dystopia. And then in chapter 21, Alex basically grows up and is like, yeah, all of this violence is really not necessary. It's interesting because most people have seen the movie, and the movie just ignores the 21st chapter because Kubrick thought it was bullshit. He also read a version of it that only had the 20 chapters first, but anyway. But the interesting thing is that I used to think like Kubrick. I was like, this is so like, you know, give me a boot stamping on a face for eternity, like that feels. But the more we live in this world, the more I realize that like that kind of cynicism or nihilism is exactly what they want. Now I'm becoming a conspiracy theorist, but that it's not helpful. And I do think it is our job as people in the public, as scientists, as journalists, to also work really hard. Like, hope is not something that, at least for me, it's not something that just comes to me. Like, you actually have to work for finding reasons to be hopeful, I think. And when I think about Clockwork Orange and the 21st chapter, there is an element of, it seems so deus ex machina when you read it, but at the same time, humanity is like that. Like, we do grow out of things. If we do, like, there is a generation growing up, a lot of who hate social media or don't want anything to do with it. Like, I'm not saying that's going to be the solution, right? But I do think we have to identify these things. And I think, for me at least, one of the reasons that I keep covering the field probably is that it feels to me like as long as there are people working on it, that itself like is a reason to be hopeful, versus the idea of like, everything I've told you is that I feel like we're really not giving the world the answers that they need. The only thing that would be worse was if nobody was trying to get those answers, right? And that's kind of where I'm at. That's why I'm following the field, but also doing for my light entertainment some virology, some deadly viruses and fungi to keep my spirits up. But that's kind of where I am on this, I think. And obviously, the attack on the field is making all of that way, way harder, and that's why that is also a story that needs to be covered and needs to be covered more. I had a whole thing where I was going back to Ebola, but I'm already at 45 minutes and I really want to hear your questions. So I'm just gonna say thank you very much. And yeah, questions. I can repeat the question, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Kai. So I'm going to ask a question that probably won't surprise you, but I want to pull on a thread that you mentioned a couple of times briefly that I think brings a lot of the dilemmas, that brings all of the dilemmas together. And that really is the role of the companies. You know, as you were going through all of this, I was thinking about the ways in which the companies are incentivized to try and find simple answers. And so do tend to fund and work with scientists who are using very specific types of methodologies and so on, right, that can maybe point to more simplified answers. You know, you talked about the Facebook 2020 project, and of course, David and I have both been part of that. One of the things that was most intriguing was when that paper came out that you mentioned, the very first one, the Guess at All. There was so much happening behind the scenes among all of the academic researchers to try and figure out how we deal with the PR, right? How we talk to journalists around this, because we knew that Clegg et al. Were going to come out with this and highlight the simple story, and our caveats were absolutely essential to not let the company get away with the simple end of the story.
Yeah.
I was one of the few internal to that project who is known for being a very vocal critic of the companies, and so it became my job to try and get to the journalists and convince them to tell that story. But it was wildly unsuccessful. You know, the vast majority, there were a handful that did more nuanced, and you know, of course, Jeff Horowitz wanted to tell the complete opposite version of that. And so I wonder how you think, as a journalist covering these things, how you think about those interactions, whose interests you might be inadvertently serving. Like, how do you wrestle?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thanks. Should I repeat the question? Is it on the? I probably should, right? So the question was like how I deal with the fact that there's these hugely powerful companies that are have an interest in how and what is covered, and how I kind of deal with that or wrestle with that. It's when I came into the space, I was really naive and I really didn't think about it much. And I think probably the same is true for quite a few researchers. I do think the world has changed. A lot of the people who would normally be defending or like arguing you should be working with these companies have changed the tune a lot. I think it's cost the field a few years. I think I can also understand why people at a certain time thought that there might be a way to work with these people. And I've heard people talk about people at Jigsaw and elsewhere like being super, like the individual. Part of the problem here is that the individual, so like the narrative that people hear when I say, oh, the companies are really changing the trajectory of the field, is they're paying people and corrupting people. And I think we have plenty of research that shows that that's not necessary. I mean, not that they wouldn't do it and that there's instances of that too, but that's not what it takes. I thought Joe Back-Coleman's paper on conflicts of interest was really interesting. And it got very short shrift by some people because of the whole question of should you need to disclose if you were on a paper with somebody in the past that had worked for one of these companies. But I think the basic pattern that he shows, like these companies in a research field that was new and that was fairly open to going in different directions, they had power over which directions would be prioritized over others, including what you mentioned, basically the psychology aspect of the individual, which goes towards, how do we make the individual smarter at finding out instead of going like, what is it at a systemic level? Could it be these rich companies that are making billions? So I do think there's that tension, of course. And then there's the tension that they made, because they were early in the field, they funded people who have become really influential in the field and who now, not because these people are in any way like doing something, it's just that their research happened to be in a direction that was kind of better for the company, and that's very hard to undo later on. And so I think the field, I personally wish the field would wrestle more with it. The reason I wrote about the Joe Coleman preprint, and I'm curious to see whether it comes out and where and how, is because I think the conversation hasn't really happened. And I can see lots of reasons why people don't want to have that conversation, but I also think, it would really help the field. For me personally, so part of my issue, and I mean, I could have talked another half hour, of course, about the companies. I've never talked to a single person at one of these companies. They've never, no, that's not true, actually. When I wrote about the Facebook studies, one of them talked to me. But other than that, every one of my requests always goes unanswered or is declined. I have talked to Frances Haugen, is like a whistleblower who used to work there, but it is as intransparent to me as it is to you. And I will say, as a science journalist, I am very glad that there are other journalists that are investigative journalists that are doing a lot of the work. But that's like a full, like you need to wrestle with these companies, you need a full team of people who are trying to get at these things, right? I mean, if it falls into my lap or if there's like, I'm sure as hell going to write about it, but I think we need way more than just science journalists to be covering this, right? Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's one more caveat. On every story, you're like, also, at the end of the day, if we look at the collective evidence we have on everything about social media, you have to realize that that is skewed in a systematic way by the fact that these companies have had a hand in a lot of different small and big ways in deciding which research is done, which research is published, which research is possible. That's just a fact. But a little bit like with the pandemic, you can't just keep repeating the same thing, right? I'm a reporter, I'm supposed to report news. And so you do have to find instances. And I wish there were more researchers who were willing to speak very openly about it. I absolutely understand that it's difficult. I also think the stakes are high. And I think people, at least people with a professorship still, have a lot of security. And they could speak more. I mean, this is a little bit apart from the harassment online and all the other things that can happen, of course, as So it's front and center for me now in a way that it never was before. I think one of the things that has happened in the second Trump administration is that we've really seen these masks come off. And I think it's a clarifying moment. And I think it's been clarifying for the field. How much do you go back and look at what went wrong? How much do you just try to do better? I'm all for, accountability. That's maybe the biggest problem in the world right now, is that accountability is out the window. So I'm answering is super long, but basically I struggle with it. It bothers me. And I haven't so far as a science journalist at Science found a really good way into it, other than when somebody like Joe Coleman, is probably took guts to write that, when they do that to cover it. Yeah. Go ahead.
So first of all, I really love the talk, or I agree with you that the unwavering cynicism can actually be quite naive at times. But just two quick, long questions. The first is, when people talk about misinformation, I guess like the pop wisdom, right?
Yeah.
They tend to circle around two truths that seem completely contradictory to me. One is that misinformation and propaganda is hugely persuasive and persuading people in mass very easily. And the second is correct information doesn't work, or has only modest effects, right? To me, it seems like these are quite reconcilable, which is that like everything has modest effects in the direction, right? But why? My question is not about that. The question is, do you think that the public has a taste for negative news, or readers, I should say, have demand for that, or that journalists have negativity bias in reporting?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that we want to believe the worst? Why might that be? And then my second question is, do you think that when it comes to science reporting, that and readers reading scientific studies, that they tend to overweight individual studies instead of thinking them as like kind of one draw of a random kind of a distribution of effects? Really, we should be thinking more like, okay, this is one more data point, and at one point we'll have to like do some kind of weighted average.
Yeah, I mean, on the second point, emphatically, yes, and that goes across the bench. Like, I used to call this single study syndrome. Like, in my field, it was more like, oh, there's a new study out that shows that 5 cups of coffee reduces the risk of Alzheimer's by 30%. And I'm like, I'm not interested in what that one study shows. I'm interested in all health effects of caffeine. Like, I don't care if I'm then dying of cancer or whatever. And I'm interested in the balance of the evidence, right? And I thought you saw that really clearly in the pandemic when we had a big study that showed that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work, and that question was answered. And then a new study came out that was much smaller, that if you put it together with the other study, didn't change anything. But a lot of reporters jumped on it because it was counterintuitive and it was new. And so, and that goes to your other question, I think, is I'm not sure there's a negativity bias. I mean, I do think that just in terms of the role we play in society or are supposed to play in society, there's a negativity bias in our job. Like, we're not there to say how amazing this politician is, right? We're there to say, you know, look at that dirty scumbag, essentially. I do think that there is I see more of a bias towards the counterintuitive or the unexpected, the surprising. I'm sure people have done studies on this, but I think if you give people headlines and you rate how much they want to read it or whatever, just because it's negative, I'm not sure how much that helps, but maybe a certain type of negativity, if it's negative against people that they hate, right? But I think if it's surprising, that's often what makes people want to read it, right? And I think that goes a little bit towards the MIT. I thought part of that study at MIT that we talked about was the fact that fake news were often more surprising because they were lies and that helps them spread further. I think that's one of the
novelty. Part of the argument that was
right.
One critique of part of the argument was that misinformation is more novel, but
right.
you hear the real stuff many times.
Right. Right. And so, yeah, and so I'm not sure there's a negativity bias per se. And I think there are also some outlets that have like purposefully decided to like, you know, here's a good news of the day. There's a reason that like in the American model, like your daily news ends with, and here's a story of a little puppy that was rescued, you know, like there people do want both, I think. But a little bit like what you said, I do think that the negativity, it just allows people to feel smarter. Like if you don't have expectations of the world, if you're a cynic, you're always already where everybody else is going to end up in your head. And I think that's part of it. And I really think I used to watch Succession and I used to love it. But thinking about it now, I'm sometimes like, God, it's another show about awful people doing awful things and coming and getting away with it. Like, is that like, if we keep telling these stories, if that's like, there's a reason that maybe Greek myth was about, you know, people doing amazing feats or something and not just about terrible people doing terrible things. You can always say you're just showing what's happening, but I do think that's, yeah.
Question from online and
yeah.
2 minutes.
Oh, sorry, I'll try and be faster, yes.
One read too. So the online question is, this is related, what kinds of studies or findings about misinformation would you be most excited to cover as a journalist?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, I think it's so hard. Like, I think obviously anything that has a bit fewer caveats. So I did like one reason I covered that story that Brendan Nyhan did recently on pre-bunking election misinformation. That was Brazil and the US. Like that, like I feel like there should be more that's done outside of the US. There's more that should be done in several populations. Like showing something once in one population at this point, it's just not that helpful, I think. And then I do think mechanistically, like a lot of it still feels so descriptive, and I do sometimes wonder, like, is there, but maybe that's just not possible, like human beings are infinitely complex, but I do sometimes wish there was a little bit more that gets at what is driving some of these things. And maybe there's like, through causal inference and other things, I think there's exciting ways that the field is going, trying new methods to show causality, for instance. I think that would be helpful just to get that out of the way. I'd be excited to cover that, I think. Adam, I think you had a question.
Yeah, it's sort of related on the incentive structure. So thinking like, so as a researcher, my incentive when talking to a journalist is to get you to think that I have great research that should be amplified, and that everyone else is an idiot that doesn't know what they're talking about. And so kind of thinking about this competitive.
Right, but to do it in a way that makes it sound like you're super collegial and yes. Yeah.
And very modest.
And very modest, exactly. Yes.
A lot of the field is set up as these competitive pressures come from academics. Because you get the grant money, you get the publications, you get the claim. And so I'm just sort of wondering sort of how you think about it. So I think like as a field, we should be more cooperative in trying to find. So my bigger question is trying to think about like more synergies through different conventions, that sort of thing.
No,
and I'm wondering kind of that kind of from your perspective as a journalist, what kind of, so it's not really a question, it's an observation that I've made thinking about how academics think about this.
Yeah.
And, right, as they were just saying, it's like, no one's going to come out and say this, right? But this is, right, it's the subtext there.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of wondering.
I mean, some people do. Yeah.
And so, one way to, the answer you just gave was like, oh, if I write my studies about multiple countries and I focus on causality, I'm going to be more appealing to journalists because that's going to be more novel, right? But that's not what you're trying to get at. So I'm just kind of wondering, thinking about this.
I mean, I think the field is very immature. And I think there's a lot of people, we're still in the phase where you have people pushing different interventions and, everybody's identified with a certain approach. I think what's really nice, we talked about this earlier, is the fact that people are coming in from a lot of different disciplines with different kind of methods and different angles. And I find that really, good. I will say that the Mercury project thing that, you were a part of, that's where I would want the field to go. Basically, if you want to call it that, an adversarial collaboration where you're like agreeing on how you're going to measure the impact of these things. And then you're running them against each other. And I had this conversation at lunch, like one of the problems with the inoculation is that they keep, measuring the discernment between, do you see that, that what I just told you is bad, that's in there. They're not actually measuring most of the time discernment, truth versus false. They're measuring, do they see like emotional language or whatever the signifier is that they're looking. So I do think it really helps, like having these collaborations, I think is really important. And I think it improves the work of everybody if they have to like compete in that kind of setting.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
Is that, so I've been thinking a lot about the Mercury project.
Yeah. It's fine. I already wrote my stories. Yeah.
But that was set up as a competition. The way that I read the Mercury project thing is that everyone won. Like everything works a little bit.
Yes.
And so what do we? So it's set up as a horse race. There's no winner. So then what do we take? Right? And so kind of thinking about, what you see as a success, I think is like, that's great. That framework was a success, but the outcome, because it was done in a competitive way, kind of, we didn't advance as a field. We didn't really learn anything except to say.
I feel like I learned something. Like I do feel like everybody kept saying their intervention was so good, and just seeing that all of them are basically, to some extent, I mean, like statistics and all, it's complicated. I know how many people drop out and all that, but essentially it's like, okay, I mean, you can argue whether it's good news or bad news, but at least like it all is kind of in a similar thing. That tells me that for me there was a lot of information in that outcome to me. Yeah. It's not the paper you can like with your approach go out and be like, see my approach, like, yeah, but I'm not sure I'm not sure what I would have expected to come out of it, but I think doing it that way was a good idea. And
yeah. And you learned something.
Yeah, no, I did. I mean, I covered in that article because I thought it was very interesting to tell that to people, because what you're getting in these single papers is always like, look how well this works. You have no comparator, like you have no idea. And having somebody put them all side by side and saying like, you know, they're not that different, but also they all work. And if you layer them on top, I do think immediately afterwards, people were telling me, okay, this shows that we need to layer these interventions on top of each other, like none of them alone work and all that stuff. I don't feel that that's really where the field has gone much, but that was, at the moment, that was the interpretation that I heard from Lisa and others, right? Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.